Today I'm going to be showing you when you need to be strengthening your psoas and other hip flexors, and then I'm going to show you 3 of my favorite exercises to strengthen these muscles at home. Blake Bowman here with GuerrillaZen Fitness. Have you been told that you need to stretch and release your psoas, including your other hip flexors, only to do so with no relief? If so, then you may actually need to be strengthening your psoas and other hip flexors because they are weak. How do you know if your psoas and other hip flexors are weak and actually need to be strengthened? Well, there's a couple things you can look for signs of this. One is in your posture, all right? If you tend to stand with what's called a posterior pelvic tilt, which means your tail kind of tucks underneath you like this and your hips kind of tend to push forwards like this out in front of you, all right? If you tend to stand kind of like this, what is happening here is your hips are extended and the psoas and other hip flexor muscles are long, all right? They're being lengthened and stretched in this position, all right? And that can make them feel tight, right? They're tight not because they're short and tight and in need of more stretching and release. They are tight because they are long and taut like two ends of a rope being pulled away from one another, like a guitar string, and they actually need to be strengthened. So one thing that you can look for to determine whether or not you need to be stretching your hip flexors, namely the psoas, or strengthening them is your posture. If you tend to stand with your hips kind of tucked underneath you, posterior pelvic tilt with the hips pushed out in front, you likely need to be strengthening them and not stretching them. Another thing you can do is just isometrically test the strength of your hip flexors, okay? What is hip flexion? Hip flexion is when okay? This is hip flexion, all right? Just to raise the leg up like this, we're activating the hip flexors, including the psoas, in order to do this, all right? One way you can kind of gauge the strength of your hip flexors, a very simple test. You can just stand and balance on one foot. You can hold on to something. You can lean against a wall or something like this. But what you want to do is pull your hip into deep flexion, okay, using the hip flexor muscles, and just see if you can isometrically hold this here for 10 to 20 seconds. If it's very difficult for you to hold this here, and your leg starts to kind of want to fall down like this, and it's like a 10 out of 10 difficulty-wise, holding the leg up in this deep flexion position, you probably need to be strengthening the hip flexors in this case, okay? This is obviously a very subjective test, but it's a way for you to activate the hip flexors and kind of subjectively see what's going on there. If your hip flexors are strong, it should not be difficult for you at all to hold the hip in deep flexion like this isometrically, all right? If it's very difficult to do this, you're finding that this area feels really uncomfortable, it's kind of getting crampy and weak, and the leg starts to want to fall down. Again, that is another sign that you can look for that you actually need to be strengthening the hip flexors instead of stretching them. Now, as is the case with many things, all right, oftentimes the things that we can do to assess your body and kind of figure out what's going on with it, sometimes those very same things that we use to assess it can actually be used to enhance the problem as well, all right? So the first exercise that you can actually do to start strengthening the hip flexors, if you went through those first 2 tests and you can kind of determine that yours are weak, the first one is just to isometrically strengthen them, which is the exact same thing that we did to test their strength in the first place, all right? You isometrically hold the leg in deep flexion like this. You know, whatever you do to one side, you do equal parts on the other side. If you're gonna hold this for 30 seconds, you do 30 seconds on the other side as well, all right? This is a very basic isometric hip flexion exercise. I recommend if you're starting off to strengthen your psoas and your hip flexors, start off with that, all right? There's other ways to do it, but this is a good isometric way to kind of start to activate those muscles again. Once you've done that for a while, you can kind of progress into a more dynamic movement, which would be active, more dynamic hip flexions. Again, hold on to something if you need to, or you can work on your balance here and really just stabilize on the opposite leg. And basically, you're just pulling the hip up into flexion here. Again, whatever you do on one side, you also want to be doing it on the other side. So for that, 4 sets, 15 reps each side as a progression to the isometric exercise that I showed you first. The last way to progress this is to add a weight load, all right? I like to just use a dumbbell. This is like a power block one that I have at home here. Any kind of dumbbell will work. You can also use bands to effectively kind of modify this hip flexion movement to add more of a, a load to it, resistance. But what I like to do is just kind of hold a dumbbell on my thigh here, kind of closer to the knee, the more that's going to load up the hip, right? So if it's up here, you're not going to feel that too much. So try to get the dumbbell down as far as the thigh as possible. And then basically you're just pulling up, same thing, but now we're pulling up, all right, against the resistance provided by the weight. So this is kind of the final progression that you can do at home that I'm going to show you in today's video. All right, with this, you can just keep incrementally adding more and more weight as your hip flexors get stronger. But, try this out, all right? If you have been stretching your hip flexors all the time and it's really not making any difference, it's making things worse. If you did those first 2 tests at the beginning of today's video and you kind of determined that you likely might be weak there, give these a shot and let me know how they go for you. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're struggling with muscle imbalances, postural misalignments, mobility, and flexibility issues, and you don't know which corrective exercises are best for you, you spend hours a day foam rolling, doing joint mobilizations, and everything that you do just kind of gives you temporary relief. If that is you, then you'd likely be a good fit for my coaching program, all right? Open up the description down below, click the link down there that says coaching. That will take you over to my website where you can check out my coaching program and kind of what I do as a coach. And if you think you want to work with me, then fill out the application there. If you're looking for another spot where you can go and apply for my custom one-on-one coaching, you can click this button over here. That will take you to the same page on my website. If you are not yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, make sure you go ahead and do that over here. And if you want to see another video similar to today's video, similar to today's topic, check this out over here. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.